What's up, wannabes? Gus here. Just me today. We've got a big task ahead of us. We are going to save fantasy, and we're going to do it beginning with this video. Before I get into any discussions of this topic, or even the idea of how fantasy is under attack, what we are meant to do, I want you to interact with this video by leaving a comment that states your favorite fantasy thing, your favorite aspect of the fantasy genre. It can be a particular plot point, a type of creature, a form of setting, a sort of fantasy object, a form of magic that is common in fantasy. I want to limit you as little as I can, and I want to encourage all of you who are watching this video to leave a comment. Even if you don't usually comment, even if it's your first comment on any video of the channel, because fantasy is a very dear genre to me. It would be very concerning to me if fantasy were to altogether disappear. So just so that we can all together collectively bask in as many positive fantasy vibes as possible, leave your comments with your favorite fantasy thing. Look at what other people are doing even as this is going on. I don't mind if you tune out the video a little bit to see what your fellow audience members are thinking in regards to fantasy. I want this to be a sort of pool of our appreciation of fantasy. So that is the first and foremost thing I want to do before anything begins. So the reason that I am from the top beginning with the idea that fantasy is a very broad thing that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people is that the way that I was introduced to fantasy as a child kind of reflects that. Now, I'm sure this is true for a lot of people because we come into the world as children with very little knowledge of what the adult world is like, what the world in general is. We don't quite know what is real and what is not. We are taught a lot of imaginary concepts when we are kids, and some of them are not revealed as such to us directly. Like, you know, we all have, like, the Tooth Fairy, or Santa Claus, or religion, ha ha ha, edgy. But, like, you know what I mean. Like, the boundary between what is real and what is not is very undefined at that early age. When you first start getting into video games or stories or movies or anything, the absurdities and the breaks from reality that happen in fantasy stories especially, they don't register to you as truly extraordinary or even needing explanation. For example, the Spyro the Dragon video games, the trilogy, was a huge part of my first foray into fantastical worlds, and I just kind of took for granted that I'm playing as a dragon, that dragons need sheep in order to fuel their dragonflies, which protect them, that there can be a number of different worlds where the dragons will perform different jobs to kind of keep the world running, including up to, like, insane things like crafting magic, making beasts, and weaving dreams themselves, like having an effect of the unconscious minds of all other dragons. It was just kind of, like, those games are really inventive. I think all three of them are. Obviously, I have my favorite levels and favorite moments throughout the trilogy, but it is like such an exercise in just raw imagination. What I find interesting about the very early phase of imagining things and getting into fantasy stories as a young child is that you're not even really fully perceiving the story and the world itself. Your mind often wanders to the things you don't see, to the possibilities that could be there. This is the phase of wild imagination where anything is possible, and these worlds are just kind of snapshots into the completely theoretical. I think that this is the phase that most fantasy fiction springs from. This idea of sort of thinking the way that a child thinks, or at the very least, extending your perception of things beyond what is just reality, making novel connections and exaggerating the absurdities of what is already there into what could be. Now, a lot of us grow out of this phase, especially those who start to view fantasy with a little bit more of a critical lens, or even those who kind of passively begin to absorb fantasy media, because this gets into something that I unfortunately, and it breaks my heart to call it this, but the Tolkien problem. And when I say that this is the Tolkien problem, I don't mean that the Lord of the Rings or the extended works of J.R.R. Tolkien are bad in any way. I quite like The Lord of the Rings. I loved The Hobbit when I was, growing up. That was another one of my sort of ways into fantasy. The Peter Jackson films, they're pretty good. I enjoy The Lord of the Rings. However, it is so influential and so celebrated, it kind of draws a magic circle around the imagination of a lot of people. And what I mean is, the way that, like, a sports game will have rules that are sort of pre-agreed upon. In the middle of, like, a baseball game, you're not going to invent new rules, right? Well, the same thing happens when fantasy becomes high fantasy. It becomes Tolkien fantasy. It becomes this subset within itself. You lose this ability to abstract in the way that you would in the wild imagination phase. This is quite evident in the fact that dwarves and elves and orcs and great evil overlords and objects of power start to take on very familiar shapes and archetypes and forms. It is unfortunately the existence of a mythology that has become so prevalent in the mind of somebody that it starts to become real to them or tangible or immutable in some way. It does have a shrinking effect on the whole of their imagination. Now, I'm not saying if you watch too much Lord of the Rings media or you read the books too much, it literally makes your imagination smaller, but I'm saying that this is a knock-on effect that will result from, let's say, you get into another big fantasy story, like Harry Potter, for example, or another one like Star Wars, or, Berserk, and you start to internalize those rules, you start to internalize those as an ideal that the fantasy genre is aspiring to. These old great works in your mind become blueprints for fantasy, and again, each one will in some way draw its own magic circle, and then when the Venn diagram of all of these circles collides, you are left with a very small subset of your overall imagination, the scope to which you could imagine the universe of possibilities that you could put into a fantasy story or expect from fantasy or seek out. All of that becomes narrower and shrinks. This has less of an effect on people who are just kind of watching fantasy, though it can, but the real problem is when this starts to affect works within the fantasy genre, things that exist only in relation to the previously existing fantastical works. I think the best thing that we can point to as a example of this is the isekai genre of anime, or just fantasy anime in general. Because while there are many fantasy anime that I do like and have enjoyed in the past, it is unfortunate how much of what goes into a fantasy anime is based on very recognizable iconography, very conventional, often Tolkienian interpretations of the various fantasy races, and also the trappings of Dungeons and Dragons, which in and of itself has become this sort of all-encompassing, ubiquitous, almost like non-setting. It's Schrodinger's world building in that it contains so many of the possibilities of what a fantasy world can be, and in trying to put them all in the same place or cater to all different tastes, you wind up with something that muddies the specificity of what a setting could be, while also making those distinct possibilities that are drawn from so many sources unbearably knowable. the rules of what a dragon is, or a vampire, or, you know, your favorite obscure mythological monster, they become codified and they become cemented to the point that there is this concern that to deviate from them is to deviate from the canon, and to do that is to deviate from genre, and to do that is to besmirch fantasy itself, which, to me, and in the context of this video, you probably see where I'm going with this, that in itself is a blasphemy against your own imagination. What you are saying there is that the external canons of these works that already exist and define their own identity is so powerful, but also so fragile, that it needs to be defended and advocated for so much that it needs to worm its way into every work that exists after, and especially into your appreciation of those works and the things that you will be doing. It's a little bit nightmarish, like cosmic horror even, the idea that instead of imagining our own things, taking some of our favorite things and making a story out of them, the ghosts of these past authors and the worlds that they created from their own authenticity are parasitizing the new authenticity. Circling back to the isekai slop of it all, you could end up watching like 5 or 6 of these isekai shows and like retain almost nothing of them, and maybe even mistake them for one another. It's gotten that bad. Now, on the other side of things, we have a market that I think people are very concerned about, or at least are professing a lot of concern about, and that is the big budget fantasy live action adaptation industrial complex. Post Game of Thrones, what is the next Game of Thrones marketing question? Now, I actually do not believe that this is a real avenue to truly be concerned about. There are a lot of shows, don't get me wrong, that people are like, this is the next Game of Thrones, this has to be big, this has to live up to all the hype of the early seasons of that show, and it also has to feel like that Peter Jackson trilogy of Lord of the Rings movies. And there were a lot of candidates for what this would have been. There was the Witcher series, the Wheel of Time, Rings of Power was also in the running. I'm sure there was another one. The problem with trying to conceptualize this as like something will be the next Game of Thrones, and if there isn't, you know, fantasy is in a rough spot, it's not healthy right now, it's kind of failing as a genre. I do not like how much that buys into the marketing speak, because I hope that fantasy fans realize, like even those who are like, you know, who want these big spectacles, who want these big expensive live action shows, I hope they know that this is inauthentic, that this is an effort for essentially like, you know, the Bezoses and other CEOs of the world to try and recreate essentially the same product over again with just enough of the serial numbers filed off and just enough other marketing stuff thrown in that it can be reasonably passed off as a different product. They aren't actually looking for imaginative fantasy or fantasy that is like boundary breaking. With the amount of money that is being funneled into these things, of course they all have to be whatever a CEO thinks is a safe bet. Those that do try to like push outside the box, going for something a little bit different or start to come into their own as something unique, like Shadow and Bone in its 2nd season, that stuff gets canceled, because the second you sort of start to stick out like a nail, you get hammered down. That's the problem with big budget live action stuff. A lot of it is going to tend to be bland in the modern day. Now, like, you know, I wish that wasn't true, and I'm also not saying that like there are not like big budget really successful movies that I have enjoyed over the past several years, but fantasy it's that unique combo of uniquely expensive and uniquely bound by tradition. Like the audience is generally expected to have pre-existing expectations by these executives, and these executives study the way that, like, you know, iconography and marketable features play such a role in the success of these things. So it ends up becoming this feedback loop of, this is what the people want, right? Give them something that is exactly like what they want. But when it ends up being a bland thing that is really a imitation of something before, that you know, captures its appeal sort of in name only, and only, like, you know, to the extent that it might resemble it if you squint, you just don't, that is not a formula that breeds satisfaction or long-term joy. And I don't think that it is something that can be perfected in a way that would save fantasy or make fantasy better. I think it is a lost cause. I think it's a losing battle, and I think to put too much stock in the idea that one of these shows is going to be as mind-blowing and influential as Game of Thrones is it's false hope of the highest degree, especially because not even Game of Thrones was that all the way through. Game of Thrones really started to fall off and then became a colossal disappointment. Nothing should be the next Game of Thrones, nothing can be the next Game of Thrones, and the fact that Game of Thrones ultimately did fail and left such a bitter taste in people's mouths, I'm talking about the TV show, obviously, you know, I haven't read all of the books, I've only read the first one. That should be a wake-up call, that maybe this kind of fantasy on this kind of scale is not necessarily the salvation that people want it to be. There is a common denominator between the anime isekai slop house that churns out interchangeable shows season after season in increasingly greater numbers, and the vainglorious big budget hunt for nostalgia, and it's not even fully profit motive and capitalism, though that does play a significant role. And, you know, if you're knowledgeable about the way that economics work and the way that they are affecting our world, you can't be ignorant of that component of it. But there is a sub-issue within all of this, and that is the very nature of intellectual property to begin with. Now, I'm not going to be one of those people who says, abolish copyright, everything should be like, you know, a loosey-goosey asset flip haven where, like, everybody has access to all things. That's not what I'm saying. But the idea that something that is in your mind, that is part of your imagination, can be legally property, it's an affront to the wild imagination that we all had to begin with. There's nothing wrong with enjoying stories that are from IPs, but again, you've gotta, you know, reckon with the fact that this is where, like, you know, the shrinkage starts to take place, and this is its final form, that we literally cannot imagine anything outside of orthodoxy. Now, I know what you're probably thinking at this point in the video, is that I talked about a lot of different stuff that was going on right now, but I didn't prescribe any ways to save fantasy. And that is because that task is beyond me. It's beyond any one person, no matter how much they love fantasy, no matter how educated they are, no matter how literate they are, no matter how rare their viewpoint is. There is not a strong man or a genius that can save fantasy all by themselves over the course of a single YouTube video, and if there is, it's definitely not me. I fully admit that I, you know, am not equipped to do this task, at least not in this video. Give me like several more and we'll work on it. The way that I started this video was by giving you all a comment prompt. And I know that on the surface, that might seem very superficial and very disconnected to the idea of actually saving fantasy. I know that it must feel like we have our work cut out for us. In truth, I don't really want that for you guys. Don't get me wrong, I do want the world to be a better place, but that has nothing to do with saving fantasy. The divisions between all of us in this comment section may, at the moment, feel insurmountable. But I can tell you right now, any distance of time and space, when it comes to fantasy and imagination, it is no thicker than the skull of another human being. What we are in this comment section together is a bunch of minds, each imagining individually. And that's all humanity is. Look at your fellow commenters. Read over their favorite fantasy things. Look at this wealth of true, uninhibited fantasy. And then, if you can, I want you to close your eyes and focus on those fantasies that speak to you most, that you most wish to imagine, that are absurdities that you want to accept, and that make you feel like you are more connected to the possibilities that exist beyond you. I want you to take this time to imagine it.